Thank you, Senator Hume. Senator Fawcett.
Well, thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I also rise to address this legislation which underpins the Turnbull Government's 10-year enterprise tax plan. And what I'd like to do is just outline briefly some details as to what the plan is, but more importantly talk about why the plan is important to all sectors of our economy, but particularly in the short term to the small business sector. Talk a little bit about the international experience in terms of tax plans, and then also consider the other views within Australia's political system on tax, and regretfully come to the conclusion that the opposition of the Labor Party at the moment is purely driven by politics as opposed to any basis in policy, and that stems back to their response, their views on this when they were in government. So what the government's seeking to do with this 10-year enterprise tax plan is to look at reducing company tax, and I'll get to why in a minute. But the aim is by 10 years to have reduced that from 30% down to 25%, and for small business to accelerate that in terms of their ability to have a lower tax rate. The important thing is that we'll be lifting for small business the aggregated income or turnover from 2 million to 10 million. And what's important to remember with that is that this is a gross figure. This is not a net figure. So some people would look at that and think, gosh, anyone who's making $2 million a year doesn't deserve a tax break. But that's turnover. That's not profit. So by the time you take out all the costs, operating costs, capital depreciation, stock, wages, etc., you're not necessarily talking about people who are incredibly well off, but they are the people who employ the majority of Australians. If you look at the employment statistics, small business is actually the sector that provides most openings for Australians to get work, and so it's a really important sector that we should be supporting. The lower tax rate, if that threshold, that gross aggregated figure, was lifted to $10 million, it'd be some 870,000 companies, and that equates to around about 3.4 million Australians who would be positively affected by these companies being able to invest more into their business. And over, as I said, the 10-year period, so out to 26-27, the government would gradually extend that decrease in company tax rate down to 25% for all companies. Bearing in mind that not all small businesses are actually incorporated as companies, the government would extend the unincorporated small tax discount in a commensurate manner to encourage those companies. Now, why are we doing this? Well, as a small and open economy, Australia's living standards and the quality of the services that we provide rely on our economy growing, the GDP increasing, and that is all linked to trade, to labour productivity, labour force participation and population. And there is much evidence to indicate that corporate tax rates have a significant influence on each of those factors. Australia's corporate tax rate is high compared to many countries that compete with for investment, particularly those in the Asia-Pacific region. And if we don't attract that investment, then we won't see the opportunities growing. You only have to read the papers in the last week or two to see a number of companies that have struggled, who have received a boost of foreign capital that have enabled them to continue operations, keep their doors open, and to keep Australians employed, or indeed to grow and expand their operations. There are a number of areas where it is foreign capital that is enabled to start up in the first place, which then provides opportunities for Australians to work. And so ongoing investment is an important feature in terms of productivity growth, jobs growth, which grows our GDP, and it's only when that economy grows that we can afford to spend the money we want to spend on the health, the education and other services that Australians deserve and want to have. But you can't put the egg in front of the chicken, and it actually needs the private sector to be generating that growth in order to be able to fund that in a sustainable manner. The concept that governments can just keep borrowing or increasing the tax burden, which ultimately falls on individuals, not just companies, there are countless examples, domestically but also overseas, where it shows that that is not a sustainable model. So you need private sector investment and growth if you want your tax base to be sustainable, which is the only way you can sustain the delivery of services and the standard of living that Australians want. So the issue of small business and this turnover figure, one of the, whilst I currently chair the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, in the last Parliament I chaired the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Corporations and Financial Services. And one of the things that opened my eyes to is we did an inquiry into bank loans to small business, was that it gave me the opportunity to interact with a lot of small businesses around the country. And people tend to have a view, when you're talking about a company, and particularly when you're talking turnovers in terms of millions of dollars, people tend to think of a corporation being a large company with a headquarters and lots of staff. There are lots of companies in Australia that are run by mum and dad. You know, the bookkeeper is mum and dad at 10 o'clock at night. When they've finally done the day's business, done the homework of the kids, got them into bed, and they sit up and they do the books. And yet, just because it's only mum and dad doesn't mean that their turnover is necessarily low. As we looked at a range of the businesses that came to us and talked about their relationship with banks, and we looked into the kind of capital requirements they had to either start up or expand, and we looked at the cash flows that they had, what became very obvious is that the $2 million threshold is well out of date. It doesn't reflect the reality of business in today's environment. And so as we talk about these thresholds, and particularly again remember that these are aggregated turnovers, they're not net profits, there are many companies that are being disadvantaged at the moment and restricted in their ability to grow, and it is not the big end of town. We are often talking about your neighbour up the road that has a company that might just be mum and dad. They might employ 10 people or 30 people. There are a number of companies in my home state of South Australia that are considered good local companies that employ between 50 and 100 people that should be qualifying for these benefits, but even at the $10 million mark, some of these would fall outside of it in terms of that gross turnover. And so it's really important as we consider this debate that the rhetoric that comes from those opposite, that says the government is just giving tax cuts to the big end of town, is just not true. In the vast majority of cases, we're giving tax cuts to the mums and dads and the family businesses that employ the majority of Australians, because it is a fact that has been backed up by both Australian and international experience that lowering the tax rate does encourage business to invest in its people in terms of the number of jobs, the productivity, which then actually helps grow our economy as well as providing living for more Australians. The concept that particularly small business is just somehow going to boost their profit incredibly and they'll all go off and live in mansions somewhere, it's just not borne out by the facts. The majority of business owners that I spoke to in that inquiry over the last 3 years highlighted that where they did employ staff, their staff were actually the critical ones to making the business work. If they didn't have good staff, the business did not do well. And the way that they attracted and retained good staff was to pay often above, in some cases well above, award conditions. And so a business that is doing well is almost always a business that is looking to recruit staff and to train them and to retain them, which also means to pay them well. And so there is a cycle there of investment and growth that comes from giving the business that ability to invest in that way. And so what is the overseas experience with that? Well, the OECD, which is often used in debates in this place as a reference point in terms of independent but informed thinking about these measures, they have said, and I quote, "Corporate income taxes are the most harmful for growth as they discourage the activities of firms that are the most important for growth, investment in capital and productivity improvements." End quote. And so their conclusion is that high rates of corporate tax distort investment decisions and undermine economic growth. The UK is probably a good exemplar for Australia to look at. According to the UK government, as they look at their recent recovery, and they have had a good recovery, they've seen business investment and jobs growth, they credit as a central part of that the fact that they took the main rate of corporate taxation from 28% down to 20%, and that's been a key driver of their economy. Oxford University, in their studies of this whole process, has found that that drove increased business investment by around £11 billion. Now, importantly, in 2013, the UK government did modelling, and they published the analysis looking at what were the long-term economic impacts of these tax rates, in their case from 28 down to 20%. And what they have found is that that could increase the GDP between 0.6 and 1.3%, which is roughly equivalent with the expectations of cuts here of around 1%. And again, it is that growth in GDP. It is the growth in GDP that actually provides, on a sustainable basis, the ability for governments here in Australia to provide the standard of living and the quality of services that Australians need. And so the alternative, which is to say we're going to increase services, whether it be through welfare or through other areas, without having regard as to how we're going to pay for it in a sustainable manner, if you start saying we'll pay for it by increasing company tax rates or not giving them the breaks they need to actually be able to invest and employ, then over time, perversely, you actually undermine the ability of the government to sustain those services. And so the services that you might borrow today to pay for in terms of education, in years to come, the children will be saying, well, fantastic, but there's no work because companies are not investing here and actually creating the jobs. And so I think it's good that under this government we have seen continued growth in funding and health and education and other areas, but the rate of growth is not as high as we perhaps would like, but we need to have the commensurate measures that will see Australia's economy grow on a sustainable basis so that we can afford to have the investment in our workforce and the investment eventually back into the higher growth rates in those other areas. So are we alone in this? Well, obviously not in terms of international experience. We just talked about the OECD and Oxford University and the UK government. We've seen neighbouring countries like Singapore reducing their rates down to 17%. So if all of that experience and that informed opinion says it's a good thing to do, members of the Australian public would probably quite reasonably ask the question, well, why is the opposition here not supporting the government's measures in this area? And I regret to say, Mr Acting Deputy President, that my only conclusion is that it is rank politics. Members opposite are very quick when they are in opposition to play class warfare, hence their attacks on the Prime Minister are about his own position and success as a businessman, their constant talk in this place about supporting the big end of town, etc. But the real question about the validity of the policy surely is taken from what was their position when they were in government. And so the Leader of the Opposition at the moment, Mr Bill Shorten, when he was the Assistant Treasurer it's worth looking back and saying, when he was in government, what was his view? And so I quote from Mr Shorten: "Cutting the company income tax rate increases domestic productivity and domestic investment. More capital means higher productivity and economic growth and leads to more jobs and higher wages." End quote. And he said that in the Parliament in 2011. When he was the Minister for Financial Services and Superannuation, Mr Shorten, this is on Sky News in March 2012, said, and I quote, "Any student of Australian business and economic history since the mid-1980s knows that part of Australia's success was derived through the reduction in the company tax rate. We need to be able to make life easier for Australian business, which employs 2 in every 3 Australians." End quote. So, for Mr Shorten to have believed that only a couple of years ago, when they were in government, but now that they're in opposition, to be coming out so stridently, not supporting the policy, and using the words of "it's just the coalition government supporting the big end of town," it's a red flag saying this is just political opportunism, as opposed to what they really understand to be true in terms of what is good for the economy. And it's not just Mr Shorten. Mr Bowen...
Senator Forster, point of order. Ring the bells. Quorum present. Senator Forster. Order. Please leave in an orderly fashion. Senator Forster. Sorry. Yeah, no, I understand. Senator Rhiannon, you have the call.
Thank you. I would just seek clarification. I thought it was 25 that was needed in the chamber, and there was 20.
There's
It's 19, is it?
19 is the quorum.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry I was wrong.
Yeah? Senator Fawcett.
Well, thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. You know, the numbers in the Senate haven't changed, I think, since Federation pretty much, or maybe once, but the numbers for quorum has actually been a long, established and consistent figure. So perhaps it explains why the Greens can't be trusted to run the economy if they can't actually add up a simple number. But coming back to what I was saying about the what the opposition actually believe in terms of policy. I just talked about Mr Shorten and the comments he made as Assistant Treasurer, and also when he was the Minister for Financial Services and Superannuation. But also Mr Bowen. In his book Hearts and Minds, which he wrote in 2013, he had a whole chapter titled Promoting Growth Through Cutting Company Tax. And this is what Mr Bowen said in that chapter, very aptly named in the context of this bill, in his book, and I quote, "Keating knew that the corporate tax rate needed to be cut to make Australia competitive, that capital and investment would flow to tax-competitive nations, and that this was an important job creation move. Today, capital is even more mobile than it was then, and it's important that our corporate tax rate is more competitive." End quote. So what we see from members opposite is that when they are in government, they also look around the world at the OECD, they look at other nations such as the UK, Singapore, the United States, and they see both the economic theory and the practice, and they support, not just in the odd comment, but through very deliberate statements, in the case of Mr Bowen, through whole chapters in books that he has written, putting forth on the public record what they really believe about economic theory. And what they really believe is they believe that the government's tax plan is actually the right approach for Australia. And so for members of the public who are listening to this debate, they should not be misled by the rhetoric from those opposite that this government is preferring the big end of town, quote unquote, compared to the Australian worker, because the Labor Party knows, Mr Shorten knows, because he has said it himself again and again when he was in government, that the best thing for Australian workers, the best thing for Australian families in terms of having a job, having a well-paid job, growing our economy so that we can afford the services, the funding for education and health and the standard of living that we want, the best thing that we can do is to encourage investment in business here, and all of the evidence that we have used to underpin this also underpinned Labor's attitude towards corporate tax rates when they were in government, and it says that lowering tax rates is the best way to support Australian families and Australian workers. And so for the Australian public, as they look at this debate going on, I would encourage them to realise that the rhetoric from the other side is rank political opportunism. They see an opportunity to use class warfare to try and say that the government is out of touch, when in actual fact the government is doing the prudent thing in terms of seeking to encourage investments, because, as Labor knows, as Labor has said themselves, this is the best thing for small business, for big business, because it creates more jobs and better paid jobs for everyday Australians.
Thank you, Senator Fawcett.